I think at this point we'll now open the floor to questions and discussion.
One of the questions that I have is, as far as how do they buy the original product and just copy it? Say for instance, like on defense parts. I used to work in the defense contracting industry. And is there cases where maybe the loser of the contract, since he has the designs and the drawings, might be the person that's doing some of the counterfeiting? Have you found that?
I asked Derek whatever he can take for him to take it, because a lot of these things he probably has some insight but can't share it with us.
Right. There's actually, you actually touched on two areas. If that particular, the scenario you just presented, you're getting into the issue of trade secrets. If an individual is taking that knowledge or that expertise or that expertise in that particular area regarding that particular product, and taking it to someone else and producing it, then that would fall under the area of trade secrets more so than merchandise. But I guess I can use an example. It's okay, everybody knows about it now. Callaway golf clubs. Everybody familiar with those? Callaway golf club used to be produced in the United States. They sent the production to China for what they believed to be savings. So what you had was, now those products are being produced in a Chinese factory, and now you've given them basically your trade secrets. So what you would have is authentic Callaway golf clubs going out one door, counterfeit Callaway golf clubs going out the second door. And when I say counterfeit, they're counterfeit only in regards to the trademark. The products are identical. So I'm trying to think of the proper way to say this. They're sort of cut their own throats. We had a purse manufacturer. All these purses were made in the U.S. and they decided at some point to send that production overseas. When I started doing these types of investigations about 8 or 9 years ago, about 8 years ago, it was very easy to pick out these particular purses as counterfeit. As soon as they sent that product overseas, I noticed that it was harder to distinguish between the counterfeit and the authentic. Nike shoes, you really have to be a trained individual to identify counterfeit Nike shoes from the authentic product. So what happens is essentially, you know the concept of reverse engineering? That's essentially what happens. Did I answer your question? Yeah. Okay.
When the Tigers were doing very well last fall, during the World Series and the playoffs up to that, there was a very large shipment of counterfeit baseballs that had the Tigers logo on it, and I believe maybe it was the post office that actually caught them. The balls themselves, I was just wondering if you ever know what became of the investigation and or what happens to those products that they discovered.
Not familiar with that. You said baseballs?
Yes, Detroit Tiger logos on the baseballs.
Not familiar with that. Daryl? Need to check into it.
You touched on the supply coming in from Asia being corrupted. Can you talk a little bit more about how a lot of these counterfeit products are really entering the supply chain and how perhaps public policy can impact? It seems to me if you can somehow disrupt the supply chain, the entry into the supply chain, then we can counteract this getting into the hands of consumers.
A real key is exactly what you're talking about, is to understand how products are getting in. And we can generalize countries of origin, things like that, but we really need to get very, very specific, get to the granularity of who are these people, how are they doing it. Specific to, like, you know, and maybe looking back at the Meridian Mall store, exactly how did they purchase that product, or a Department of Defense contract, how did that product get in, what was their fraud opportunity? And that's real key, is that each individual has their own specific fraud opportunity. Now when we look at all these together, we can now group them up and say that they took a substandard gasket and put it into a high-tech Department of Defense application. All of a sudden we understand, now it's the gaskets. Melamine and pet food. We understand, they're putting melamine in. Now what Michigan Department of Agriculture does and others is they test for melamine. So those are things that we can do. We can start to look at the real ways that we might detect it and then deter it as well. And then I think from a public policy standpoint it's important for us to be able to go back as researchers and look at it, understand it, and a lot of what Justin talked about, the real empirical aspects of this research, and then to be able to present back to those agencies or to the industries or trade associations what they might do to identify the product, detect it, and then deter it as well. And at that point, we're then able to talk with more detail about what type of labs we would need, what type of testing equipment, how much time does Derek need between walking into a store and finding a product he thinks is suspicious and getting a response that he can seize that product, because sometimes that product, if they're smart, they're gone, and then it's hard to track them down. So one thing that we've been trying to emphasize as a group is to step back and look at the science of it. To not generalize, but to go back down to the real science of the root incidents, and then move slowly back up. It's a slow process because we're trying to build a foundation to really understand it. And one person that was a real influence for us was Victoria Espinel, is the head of the Intellectual Property Enforcement Coordinator's Office. That was established under the Office of the Vice President and Office of Management and Budget. So she's coordinating all the activities across all agencies. And we've kind of watched when she has trouble in Congress with a question that there's not information for her to answer. That's where we would look for our first steps. And those are some kind of things that we're trying to do as well.
Just to touch on that again, the problem with law enforcement is we're behind the curve. By the time we are aware of what's coming on the market's going to be saturated with it. One of the things that we like with John and what he's trying to do is anticipate what's going to happen in the future. I'll use an example of those. Right now, everybody's into the Beat headphones. By the time we get ramped up, by the time we've identified that particular product as a high risk or a highly counterfeited product, we're behind the curve. They've already entered the country. We're trying to get up to speed to identify it, where they're going to, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. If we can start to be more proactive and anticipate trends, to talk to the industry and say, look, this is going to be the hot commodity for this coming Christmas or holiday season, then we can more proactively address it, not only at their interdiction point by letting CBP know, start looking out for this particular product, but also from the investigation point of view, we can work with CBP and try to develop whatever investigative methods that we need at that particular point in time to pursue federal prosecution or local prosecution. Unfortunately, we're behind the curve often.
Something that actually triggered me to remember that a project that we just got a grant from the FDA through the Michigan Department of Agriculture to look at food fraud. And it's a specific type of counterfeit type activity with fraud related to food. And one thing we're doing with that is creating a tabletop exercise. So bring together public-private partnerships to explain what is the fraud, how does it occur, and it's specifically, like Derek was saying, to try to start to look at prevention and to cycle back with things that we're doing, again, through the state of Michigan, up to FDA, and then also internationally as well through different World Health Organization and others, is to, again, look at these international trends. And so we're actually getting to the point of having the right questions to ask, and I think that's the first step. And so we saw melamine get into pet food, then we figured out what it was. They put it in there to deceive the tests for protein, because that type of ingredient is judged by how much protein is in it. And milk in China is judged by how much protein, where we judge it here by the fat content. So the higher the protein content, the more value. If they sprinkle in a little melamine, it then deceives the tests used for protein. Melamine is an additive used to make plastic bottles soft. There's no way it should be in a food in any real quantity, but they put it in to deceive the test. That's brilliant. It's brilliant science of what they did. But we understand now why they did it. Not just that it was melamine, but we understand why they did it. Now we can ask the question, what's the next melamine? Well, the next melamine would be something that mirrors that fraud act. And the fraud act was to deceive those tests. So those are the kind of things, like, again, to give a plug for to thank FDA and Michigan Department of Ag for working together on this. Those are things that we are able to move forward. When we have those kind of resources and we have the time to work together, the time to work with Derek and others, we're able to dig down and get very, very close to the issue and actually start to prevent fraud.
If I can jump in here for a second. I think this is a great example of what makes our ACAP program unique. One of the biggest challenges in this area is the fact that there's very little data and analysis that's out there. Obviously, industry gathers data, various government agencies gather data, but that's not data that they can often share. And the time that they do have for analysis is generally limited to more tactical aspects and investigations. And what we're trying to do is help to be that analytical arm of all these different organizations so we can start to help to gather the information, make some sense of it, and do, as Derek suggested, that analytical piece that can help us to identify trends and understand patterns and variations globally and regionally and by product, so we can start to identify some of those strategic lessons. But all that is really kind of in the infancy stage as we're trying to gather the data and make some sense of it. And as Justin talked about, we have this open source incident database we've been gathering. That's a direct result of our understanding that we need data to understand this problem, and it's very difficult to access the data. So we started gathering data on our own so we can start developing those lessons. But we do have partnerships underway with various organizations where we're trying to help to serve as like a clearinghouse for that data and analysis.
Can an average consumer identify counterfeit products, and how do you educate the public of what to look for?
As I said, the counterfeit trade, IPR violations are evolving. As I was telling John before I came in here, we used to tell individuals, number one, if the price is too good to be true, it usually is. Buy from a reputable retailer. Sometimes you can look at the quality. But now that this crime is evolving and becoming more sophisticated, those techniques may not necessarily be effective. As I said, I've given presentations when I said, if you're buying your jersey from a trunk of a car, if it costs $10 and you know jerseys normally cost $200 or $150, it's probably counterfeit. But that Meridian Mall case was unique. The store looked like a Foot Locker. It looked like, if you walk into Sears or Macy's, it was set up just like a legitimate retailer. And individuals were buying it. They were buying it at prices that were close to legitimate product prices. So it's becoming much more difficult to identify products. The trade has evolved to that extent. A trained eye, and the trademark holders obviously will be able to identify it. You can say things like misspellings in the tags, certain quality items, zippers or things of that nature. You can use those, but frankly, it's becoming much more difficult to identify counterfeit from authentic merchandise.
The other thing that adds to that difficulty is obviously the proliferation of the internet. And so now we're going from transactions in a physical space where people can inspect the product and they see the person they're buying it from, to basically anonymous transactions where, if they're lucky, they get to see a picture of it. And just because they see a picture of their product doesn't mean that's what they're actually getting. And so we have work underway as well where we're looking at victimization online, but that adds to the level of complexity.
Yes, excuse me. Do you have any particular insights or recommendations regarding potential counterfeiting that involves powdered infant formula, which is a significant concern to some of us here in the audience?
Can you ask your question in a different way again?
Well, I represent the Women, Infants, and Children program. And of course, 60% of the infants in Michigan receive WIC benefits and receive infant formula, 90% of which is powdered. And so we are ever vigilant and on guard with our 2,000 grocery stores that accept WIC EBT cards. And our concern is making sure that the powdered formula that's being delivered to our recipients is legitimate powdered formula, because clearly, if it's not, if it's counterfeit, there's a huge public risk at stake here as far as the health of our infants. So any guidelines or insights that we can get to help us in our endeavors would be much appreciated.
Again, unfortunately, sometimes you're our best source of information. You're our best leads. And I just have to put it bluntly. Unfortunately, sometimes the only way we'll know is if someone gets sick, that child's not gaining weight, if the product doesn't smell good, if it doesn't look right. The key is when you run across those situations, don't just dismiss it. We've talked to some companies when they get a bad product or a customer complains about the product, all they do is throw it into the defective bin and they give them another product. Don't do that. What you have to do is take it, call the right individuals, call FDA, call USDA, call MSP, call our office. That's where we're going to get our leads from. You'll see it before we do. We're not experts on this. We don't know what to look for when it comes to that. So that's what we're trying to do. That's the reason why we're doing this outreach. So in the future, if you do run across something like that, and unfortunately it does come down to a situation where kids get sick. Dogs die from the melamine dog food. But don't just dismiss it.
One thing that we definitely have done, and infant formula is a really active group, and they definitely do market monitoring. They look at where products should be and where it shouldn't be. I think it also, we've had previous training early this year where local law enforcement will notice infant formula in a convenience store someplace where it shouldn't be. So there's definitely, and Derek alluded to this too, health and safety risks first, and those are where a lot of the resources are focused, both on the public side and the private side as well. So there's a lot of vigilance out there. There's also excellent food-related outbreak and incident, foodborne illness, quality concern systems and networks. And so through CDC, there's things called PulseNet, FoodNet, and other types of resources to then burst out to people at grocery stores, the purchasing managers, supply chain people, to know when there could be a problem. So there is quite a network in the food-related area as well.
So CDC is the Center for
Disease Control in Washington, D.C., yes. And through FDA and others.
As I understand it, one of the biggest problems with counterfeiting is the outsourcing. Like the Defense Department outsources, and so they get all kinds of defective parts, and the defective part was even found on the president's helicopter. And those things are dangerous. The other thing I'm curious about is China, according to the CBC movie I saw, is the biggest place where most of the fake products come out of. What I'm wondering about is, what are they making that we could copy? Seems like there is anything.
Well, a serious point is in there as well, is looking at countries of origin. And that one of the toughest, well, the fraud opportunity is that if we target one country in particular, say it's Defense Department product that comes from one country of origin, if you were a bad guy in that country making product, if we started watching all the gaskets from Canada, and you were selling product into DOD, and they started to look at those gaskets, then one of the first things you might do is change the country of origin. Even though you're in Canada, you're a counterfeiter. Who's to say you can't say it comes from Mexico or Guam or wherever else? And that adds, there's tremendous complexity to this as well. And they'll even do things called origin laundering, where they'll take a product manufactured in one country, it will say made in Canada, ship it to a free trade zone, Panama or Dubai, wherever, change the labels. And a free trade zone doesn't have any real oversight in it. That product can come out with any label on it possible. So, like the work that Derek and they do is, and this is like Robert Ludlum's story stuff. When you hear some of the stories and the things that they do, undercover, the complexity of the situation, it is unbelievable, and it is as complex as any spy novel you would read. And these bad guys have such a opportunity that they are very resilient. They're clandestine, they're stealthy, they're actively trying to avoid detection, they're patient. And one thing that we've seen when organized crime is more involved, the biggest issue there, other than funding of higher quality product, is they're disciplined. if a bunch of pot dealers get together and start counterfeiting product, they're going to show up at a car dealership with a duffel bag full of cash and buy a car. That triggers something. Derek gets a call if someone walks in with $50,000 in cash to a car dealership. Organized crime would be more disciplined, and they wouldn't do that. So there's a number of issues going on here that make it just, again, it's the, stories can be written about the complexity of some of these networks.
The other thing complicating the country of origin is the fact that some of these products can originate in many different countries. So, several different countries can each manufacture a piece that gets sent here and then assembled in the U.S. and it doesn't become a counterfeit product until it's actually all the pieces are put together and assembled.
Can I use a brief example? Like, for example, perfume. The juice, that's what the actual liquid is called, can be produced in China. The bottle itself, or the bottling of the product, can occur in Canada. So is that a product of Canada, or is it a product of China? The item that causes the harm is the juice itself. But when you're talking about customs laws, importation laws, that whole country of origin aspect is very complicated. That's why they have customs brokers. That's why they have experts who do that type of stuff. Those are the types of complexities that we have to deal with.
You indicated earlier that product safety is a main concern for distribution or allocation of your funds. How much of your time is spent reviewing internet sites to see if there are products out there that have a high likelihood that they might be counterfeit? And I got a follow-up real quick. Is what kind of strategies do you use to try to find those items? Because what we find with WIC is that at times individuals are selling the formula online on eBay or Craigslist or whatever, and we're just trying to facilitate trying to find these people. And I was wondering how you go about your search. So it's kind of tied in.
Getting a little bit into the area of Tradecraft, we don't necessarily want to divulge our techniques.
Trade secret.
So yes, it's actually to see the way that a lot of companies go through doing this. That they will have groups under corporate security that are market monitoring, and that's every market, everywhere, anywhere, and they'll look for suspicious activity and then they'll track it. And there's definitely companies that all they do is search the internet for your product to see if it's out there. And then they provide information back. The key with some of those companies is that they're looking at this for hundreds of types of products. And they're looking at hundreds of types of websites. They start to be able to pick out which ones are more suspicious than others. Maybe they see a cluster going on in infant formula and in lawn fertilizer or something that's similar. And so there's definitely a lot of intelligence gathering that goes on to try to identify those.
And frankly, the squeaky wheel gets the grease. If a trademark holder makes that outreach to the IPR center, they're probably going to get results. If you just lay back and don't be proactive, for lack of a better term, in protecting your trademark. In fact, we always say that all the time. If this was an industry group, we said that the money spent on a dedicated brand protection group or brand protection manager is money well spent, because they'll have that direct connection to the IPR center. The IPR center will take that lead based on the information that it provides, and they'll farm it out to the specific offices, to particular offices, and then we'd act on them.
The question is kind of twofold. One is about either creating a database or registry, or there's so many generic type businesses, and they can buy batteries sometimes with names you've never heard of, or on smaller grade products. Are you finding that you're able to develop those kinds of databases? And also with wholesalers and distributors, is there a way, because it's ideally in their best interest for their business to keep track of knowing what their products are so they don't get sued, or they're not helping to perpetuate the problem. I just wonder about the whole undercover nature of things being disguised under ambiguous names and product distribution lines. The other thing is, about 6 years ago, Senator Stabenow had discussed having either a federal or an international prosecutor, because there was a company outside of the Grand Rapids area who was a woodworking tool company, and all of their product, even down to the instruction book, was copied exactly. And the problem was they had to sue not only the company in China, but also they had to sue the Chinese government, so they had nobody else on their side. So the cost to them was very prohibitive. So could you explain whether there is any federal effort to help people countersue or get any kind of retribution for that kind of?
Well, and one thing, the Intellectual Property Enforcement Coordinator's Office was set up to coordinate those kind of things. They work really closely with trade and industry. The bottom line is that we need to work together, and a big piece is the industry role in prevention in the first place. Prevention would discourage people from trying to counterfeit their product, but also specifically prevention is tying directly into Derek, the IPR center people, so that he can walk in quickly and identify if the product's counterfeit, and to help align the industry countermeasures with what we need for enforcement, and then all the way through to prosecution as well. And there's a number of things in that area that are definitely going on.
Okay. There's one more question in the back.
I guess my question is just on the consumer side. At what point, where is this threshold where consumer demand for extremely cheap products or consumer habits where, there's a supply side and there's a demand side, and I understand the crack on the supply side, and I understand the ease of enforcement on the supply side, but at some point there has to be, it takes two to tango in a sense. So you have to have a consumer that's either going to be purchasing a product and they aren't aware, or purchasing a product and they are aware. And obviously, with some of the numbers that you showed, that is the case. People are obviously purchasing products that are counterfeit because they want the cheapest good. So how does that fit into this whole conversation?
Well, I think any kind of intervention that we would want to think about to disrupt product counterfeiting would have to be, very focused and specific. With many of our projects, what we try to do is choose like a very specific type of problem, or like a product, for example, and then try to understand the nature of that so we can identify concrete ways of addressing it. So in this circumstance, what we would think about is kind of a multifaceted approach, because with a lot of our work, what it suggests is that consumers don't necessarily, or they're not necessarily aware of the dangers of product counterfeiting and all the sort of surrounding circumstances to that. And so one approach under that scenario would be to, do further training and awareness, so people realize that yes, maybe they're buying a cheap product, but in doing so, they're also fueling this other sort of criminal enterprise that has all these other sort of damaging consequences. And by doing that, then they're hurting their local economy, and now law enforcement resources are being taken away to fight this instead of other things. And so because product counterfeiting is very diverse, lots of products, lots of ways that it's done, I don't think it's possible to kind of come up with that one silver bullet. I think we have to kind of narrow down on the particular aspects of the problems and build comprehensive evidence-based strategies tailored to those specific instances.
Okay. I've learned so much from our speakers, but I've also learned quite a bit from the questions that have been asked. So this has been an excellent exchange. I will tell you that the website for ACAP at MSU is wonderful. If you're taking back information to staff or your legislator or your community, you would want to refer them to that website. There are a few videos that I think Dr. Wilson had mentioned that are really outstanding and brings it home. So I would recommend that you provide that information to others. And then this was a great brochure. I just went through it very quickly, and again, it's very explanatory and a good handout maybe for constituents or voters. So, do you think you need one last word? Do we need to go down the line on one last word?
We covered quite a bit.
We really did cover quite a bit. But Are you okay?
I'm
okay. Okay, very
Well,
good.
I'll say a word to wrap us up. I appreciate everyone taking the time to come here today to learn a little bit about the nature of this problem in Michigan. We appreciated the opportunity to share some of our work with you. As I said in the very beginning, we've just started to scratch the surface, but we hope to serve as a local, state, national, international resource on this problem. And so if you are ever interested in learning more about this problem or how we can engage, please pick up the phone, give us a call, send us an email, and we look to partner with virtually anybody who's interested.
Very good. Thank you. And you guys, please help me thank our panelists. Thank you. Dr. Wilson is so right, though. You had quite a few choices of places to be today, so we're very thankful that you showed up here. We hope that you'll spread the word. I have a few announcements. One is that our next forum is substituted by our fundraising event. The Michigan Political Leadership Program annual dinner is being held in February 28th. There are two locations, actually, and one of them is not here. One is in Livonia, and then one is in Grand Rapids. February 28th is Livonia, and then March 1st is in Grand Rapids. It's always a really fun event. It's the largest multi-partisan event in the state, and so I would encourage you to check that out on IPPSR's website as well. And then finally, the March 20th form, you've probably received one of these in the mail. This is the first of the forums. As I said earlier, we have 3 more to go, and the next one is March 20th. So that's going to be on agribusiness and what that means to the state. So they couldn't be here today. They're holding their big conference across the street at Lansing Convention Center. So we invited them to come in March. We hope that you can join us as well. So don't forget to fill out your evaluation forms. And thank you very much. Enjoy the rest of your day and tune in to the governor this evening.